So my name is Mette Juhl Jessen. I'm a landscape architect and a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. I'm from the section of landscape architecture and planning design, and then I've been invited here as part of the LEANER Fellow program. I work with regional climate adaptation, so climate adaptation at a large scale. And I work mainly with coastal zones, looking at planning and maps, and trying to see what it would mean if we could push forward a bit more of what I call an oceanic understanding of planning in these zones. My presentation today I've called Perceptions of Water. And first I want to get back to Rand's Vilje, the novel I quoted the opening sentence from. Then I want to take us through a touch on climate change risk and the perception of water in a Danish case of flood risk management. And then finish up with what we can maybe hopefully discuss also over lunch, different perspectives on water, how to think with and through water in different ways. So I grew up in Denmark. This is a silhouette of Denmark. It's in Scandinavia, north of Germany, southwest of Sweden and Norway. And this novel, Rand's Vilje, takes place where I put a little red cross here. Denmark is a small country, but has a relatively high percentage of coast. So we say there's 8,500 kilometers of coast, so it's very present in the landscape. But in the middle of the 19th century, what was done in Denmark, and I think many parts of Northern Europe, was a lot of land was claimed for agriculture as well. We put up a lot of dikes, we claimed a lot of fjords, we dried a lot of old bogs to make them say useful agricultural land. One place that was done was down here by the Red Cross, where the novel takes place. Previously, this was like a vibrant fjord landscape, but now you see a very hard line, because after a big storm in 1872, a huge dike was built. It's 4 meters tall and 63 meters long, so you can see the coastline there. It's like a line cut through the landscape. And this has happened many places, and then after, what has been done is that agriculture and also settlement has happened all the way up to the dike. So suddenly this whole zone that used to be a vibrant landscape of water and dry gets a notion of control and is suddenly inhabited. So yes, just to say that in Denmark the situation is different. We also have rivers which also pose challenges. Our main problem so far has been coast, but the issue of rivers are very much coming up as well. But I think there are notions between how to deal with coastal landscapes and how to deal with river landscapes that bring a lot of similarities across. So this novel, Rand's Vilje, or Rand's Will, takes place down there where the coast is now super sharp. And this is a drawing of how it was before the dike was built. This is the landscape of water coming in and out, small little islands in the landscape. And this is just before that storm in 1872. And the novel takes place in this period. This old sailor, Roar, he's been living a very, very tough life out in the seas, rough conditions, and then he decides to settle. He settles on that little island. I don't know if you see the little house here. That's where he chooses to settle. But what's special about Roar is that he knows the seas from being a sailor out there. He knows the water. He knows how unruly and uncontrollable it is. And with the Danish literary scholar Søren Frank, who say that Roar then established himself as an adaptive coastal existence here. He sort of knows the potential hazard the sea can pose. He knows that by placing himself there in the mouth of the fjord, he is quite exposed to the ocean that's just in front of him. But then you can say he's maybe less vulnerable as an individual because he understands the landscape he's living in. He understands the nature forces around him. And then the house he built is very resilient. He puts it's described in the novel, so it's a fictional novel, right? But it takes place in the actual time just before this storm surge. He puts his grain up on the roof. He makes sure that he can put up shutters in front of the house and that the water can come in on the lower level. So in that sense, his total risk when this storm surge happens is less. So the actual storm surge happens in 1872, and there's dramatic accounts of dead bodies floating around in these fjords. It was 260 people died at land or at sea, animals, natural areas, everything. It was quite chaotic, quite wild, and the one reaction to that was building up dikes. But Roar, the sailor here, he was maybe less at risk because of these different factors. And so to bring the notion of Roar and this old sailor's level of risk into IPCC's notion of risk, this is one understanding of what does it mean to be at risk. And from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, this definition keeps on developing. It's not static, it's a developing thing, saying being at risk is a mix of there being a hazard. It could be a flash flood or a storm surge. Then being exposed to that hazard if water comes somewhere where nothing else is, so it doesn't necessarily create a risk that the water flows over what's normally dry land. Then there's also a question of the vulnerability of either the ecosystem or the person or the social system living there. You can be less vulnerable if you're very good at adapting, or if you're very, say, strong, if you know your landscape, if you know the context, if you have a strong community so you can react to a certain hazard. And then lately, the IPCC says there's also this important notion of how we respond to a climate that is changing. Are we creating more risks by putting up dams somewhere, or putting up dikes, or diverting rivers, or putting them into tunnels? That is also a way of increasing or decreasing risk. And one way to deal with risk through sort of on an EU level is through the Floods Directive. And in that it's stated that floods are natural phenomena which cannot be prevented. However, some human activities, such as increasing human settlement and economic assets in floodplains, so that's the exposure part of it, and the reduction of natural retention by land use and climate change contribute to an increase in the likelihood and adverse impacts of flood events. So there's one thing that is water moving over what is sometimes dry land. That's a given, that's a natural phenomena. But then what human societies do in those areas, that's maybe what's creating the risk. To implement this floods directive, all the member states of the European Union have to do a flood risk assessment of the country, then draw up flood hazard maps and flood risk maps, and then do flood risk management plans. And this is very technical maybe, but I want to take you through it to talk about how water is presented through this process. This is again Denmark. We know now the coast down there, the hardline coast that's red. And if anyone has ever been to Copenhagen, it's up here. And all the little red dots and lines, they are risk areas, and all the orange ones are new risk areas. So the areas that are conceived to be at risk in Denmark is already, every 6 years this process goes, and new areas are being added or subtracted because the definition and the understanding of what risk is also changing. For a long time, it was very much where will water come versus where is there something of economic value. That was how the risk was calculated. This is a big risk because it's going to be very, very expensive. Now, this round, the new areas are also very affected by saying where there's some societies that would have severe social consequences as well. So the definition of which areas are important to have a look at in case of floods are all the time developing as the idea of risk is developing. So for each of these areas, a flood hazard map is drawn. That's the one over to your left. For different scenarios, saying this is where, in case of a storm, and the 1872 storm is like one of our favorites. We always go back to that when we are to imagine what it would look like in the future. We say, back in 1872, something wild happened. In the future, the water would probably act something like the same. It would go the same ways as that storm. So that's still sort of the reference point. So these flood hazard maps are drawn saying where do we imagine water would be in case of a certain event, say 20-year storm, a 100-year storm, an extreme event combined with sea level rise, but also what kind of storm surges could happen. And then flood risk maps are drawn out. That's the one in the middle saying, and the value here for each notion is the money. So how the darker, the more expensive a flood would be in that area. So that's how the risk is evaluated, which does not necessarily resemble over on the floods map to your left. The darker blue is the deeper water levels. That's not alike with the risk. And then the municipalities have to make risk management plans to deal with this risk. That's sort of the flow of the implementation of this directive. And just to show you a little bit below something like that, what is at stake and what makes an area at stake could be, say, public infrastructure. This is taking the blue or the orange away and looking at the landscape below. This is the S train, like the U-Bahn in Berlin, or like the public local train. That area would be flooded in an extreme event, or areas of residency as well would be flooded in cases of extreme events. What then happens is that the municipalities that are affected take this data in and make some plans. And in these plans, they use the data, of course. And over on your left, you have for a different municipality in the same area, showing how would a flood look like in this year, that year, and the other year. And then on the right is the municipality has to then come up with what will we do to address this risk. And I think one thing that is quite interesting in these scenarios over there, the last one, the one down here is the year 2115, so that's a bit ahead, and the other ones are earlier years. But in these ideas, a flood is always something that's put on top. It's data fields that's put on top of the landscape. The landscape is never altered, so imagining the world 100 years ahead, it is still the same landscape, but the flood is just something that comes on, and then we can take it off again. And I think a little bit related, what the municipalities, the words the municipalities use are words like flood risk, flood damage, flood danger, and this notion that to protect the coastline. There's a strong emphasis on coastal protection, and that does not mean support the natural systems along the coast. It means to hold the line, basically, which is a big challenge as sea levels rise and storm surges intensify with climate change. Now, why this whole technical notion about how planning goes on in Danish municipalities? Well, partly to say something, or to try to give an example of how this discourse of the ocean is, and that it's not a given. And you can say ocean, but you could also say water body or river, but in this case, ocean has just been my case. Since some would say 50s, others would say the 70s, we've had what's called an oceanic turn, especially within the humanities and within geography, turning attention to the ocean again, saying, all right, we've talked a lot about land, but the ocean is actually a very, very big part of this planet. Things like Philip Steinberg's The Social Construct of the Ocean, saying the ocean is a social construct, or Jamie Linton's What is Water, trying to understand what is the concept of water, even it's something in a glass, but it's also an idea we have. And then the lower one, A Poetic History of the Oceans, is a Danish literary scholar called Søren Frank, who's part of a wave you'd call Blue Humanities, looking at everything about water in literature and poetry and philosophy. And what he says is looking at literature and travel logs and the Bible, the Christian Bible, and all kinds of different documents. He says there are developings in this idea of how we understand the water as human, how humans understand oceans. He says until the mid-15th century, you could talk about like a theocentric period, very religious period. The water was something dangerous, it holds monsters, it's out there, and we should just stay as far away as humans as possible from this dangerous thing out there. Then we move into, Søren Frank says, an anthropocentric area, not the Anthropocene, but an anthropocentric, so human-centered period, until the middle of 19th century, and that's the era of ships and sails, and at least for many parts of Europe, colonization, going out to conquer the world. So this is a period where the ocean is suddenly seen maybe a bit more as chance. It's also risky, it's dangerous to go, but it's also chance and possibility. It's not something to shy away from. Then, starting from the middle of the 19th century, moving into a more technocentric period, and this is the period of the big, strong dike in the novel and in the reality as well. So now we turn to this idea that we can control the landscape. It's the era of steam, it's the era of machinery. The ocean becomes this grid. It's about control and science. We can predict it, we can control it, we can do what we want somehow with this ocean. And then Søren Frank says, then from the middle of the 21st century, there's this emerging awareness in literature and philosophy saying, the oceans is also something that connects the planet. It's this big motor and it's a heat pump. It has an effect if we put plastic into it. It's warming, it's rising. There's sort of a more holistic understanding of the ocean rising or coming into parts of literature. And of course, these periods, they're not closed off eras and they go over each other. But I think it's an interesting notion to say, oh yeah, what the ocean is, it's not static. And in these Danish planning documents, we're very much in a technocentric era. It's something about control, almost sometimes theocentric. It's this monster we just have to keep out with all the control we have. Can we then sort of move the discourse a little bit in planning towards something? Well, Philip Steinberg, who did this, the social construct of the ocean, and I'll do this very brief, but I think it's an interesting notion to leave you with. Philip Steinberg and Kimberly Peters have introduced this idea of wet ontology. They say, can we think with the ocean? They say, thinking from a perspective informed by the ocean's material and phenomenological distinctiveness can facilitate the imagining and reliving of a world and our being in the world, providing a way of engaging with and speaking to a vibrance. It's a bit lofty, but the base idea of it is saying this time of the Anthropocene, of climate change, of unruliness, the ocean is also unpredictable and unruly, and the way we understand the world would maybe benefit from being a bit more wet, being a bit more from the water. This is a text back from the notion they introduced back in 2014-15, and then they say in 2019, they come back and say, ooh, we've gained a little bit, because of course the ocean is not just wet, it's more than that, it's not confined to being out there. The ocean is also, first of all, within different bodies. I mean, the water is in our human bodies and in plant bodies and in river, but it's in anywhere else. It's also beyond the ocean. It's something we can smell, or we can sense the salt when we walk next to the ocean. Another thinker, Dilip Da Cunha, would say that wetness is everywhere. Like, there's humidity all the time. There's moisture in the air. There's clouds. It's not something that's just in some water body. And then there's also the notion of the ocean imagined. It's also in literature and in ways we think about it, stories we tell about the ocean. And there I think Georgia has a huge leap ahead, and something we could be very inspired by in Denmark with these stories of the ocean and the naming of the river and telling these narratives, because I think it's so powerful. We have a cute little recent contribution, again from a Danish writer called Siri Rana Hjelm Jacobsen, who wrote Havbrevene, ocean letters, where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean, they're sisters, and writing letters to each other. It's a very, very short little novel, but it creates a different perspective, and it's both playful and fun, and it also makes you a little bit humble, saying, oh yeah, the oceans are out there. In this novel, the oceans have this plan to take over the planet again. Once again, it's going to be one big blue planet. And there are other things to the novel. It's very lovely, and I hope it will soon be translated to other languages, because that helps maybe with playfully taking on what you can call an oceanic perspective. And I think these moves of playing a bit and using our imagination is an important shift. And then as a planner, I would also say we have to get away from these lines and talk more about zones instead of this fighting for lines. We have to understand that things are moving, and maybe these oceanic perspectives can help us. And then we need to lift the gaze, which is again into maybe the time of ocean, saying this is a long time span. It's not these short cycles of planning that we do at the moment. We have to dare to look at how would the world actually look like in 2216, and then we can start making a plan from there on how to act today. And with that, I want to say thank you so much.